To continue our line of thought and our discussion from today, Tuesday, September 22nd, about collective trauma, as well as this debate about how and when it's appropriate to write about grief versus joy, or with anger or humor, and obviously a blend might be preferred. We discussed that in class, but I wanted to connect that conversation that we had today in class with the two readings for this week that seem to fit pretty well into those concepts of collective trauma and also inherited trauma and grief, and finding joy and finding ways to write about joy. So how do we reconcile those two opposite poles of the writing spectrum? So in our book, on page, I'll start with one and then move to the other. So I'll start actually further towards the end of the book with Eliot's piece, Alicia Eliot, page 246, and then I'll move backwards to Talbert 154. Partly to begin with grief, and then move into spaces of joy and try to find this. I was a little distracted because my studio mate was walking around, so I didn't want to interrupt him. Okay, so page 246. There's a lot to talk about in this essay, and I'm sure that the conversations that we'll have in our written dialogue on the synchronous Google Doc will cover a lot of these topics, but I just wanted to touch on a few of these themes that I've noticed in the piece as I reread it for this discussion, that I wanted to bring up, and tying threads between our conversation about the previous three readings, particularly the essay by Jensen about etymology and wordplay and detailed linguistic analysis. And right on the second page of this piece by Eliot on page 247, she begins to investigate and unearth meanings and etymologies, origins of words. So she defines melancholia. And I think part of her motivation, as you see if you start to read the essay, is to play into this questioning of the therapist that appears on the first page. He seems to be trying to define depression, specifically her depression, and say, what is the source? You must know the source. And she doesn't know, and partly because so many varieties of depression are sourceless. And I put that in air quotes because then in this essay, Eliot kind of turns that idea on its head and says that yes, even if depression seems to have no source, it could be inherited or could actually be pretty blatant in its cultural and historical origins, or at least tied to inherited traumas of one's people or one's history. So that is to say, on the second page of the essay, she begins to investigate the meaning of melancholia. And then from the etymological origin of that word, melancholia, she then moves through an abbreviated history of depression, at least as it's defined by and treated by societies or people in control, people in power. Namely, she moves through, in a religious setting, how is depression defined and treated with exorcism. And on page 248, she mentions in the 2nd century BCE that melancholia was a form of demonic possession treated with exorcism, and this often entailed beatings, restraint, starvation as a cure. Then she moves on to describe that further along in history, skipping ahead to the Renaissance, the views of early Greek physician Hippocrates, a heavily Christian Europe, had another way to describe those with mental illness, witches. And she skips ahead. She drops in a little Shakespeare reference with Ophelia and the ways that Ophelia reflects or represents a certain type of melancholic woman, who then would be tied to the image of a witch because she floats. So she traces this history in and then ties it in with her family history and her personal experience. So her mother being diagnosed or misdiagnosed, and the confusion that's met with her mother's depression in the eyes of doctors and different diagnoses, and also her family. And I found that on page 249, she starts to draw this really interesting connection between the sources specifically for Native peoples and Native cultures of the possible origin of this predominance of depression. So the high, page 251, halfway down. Though suicide was quite rare pre-contact, after contact, and the subsequent effects of colonialism, it has ballooned so much that as of 2013, suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading cause of death for Native people under the age of 44. So that she's starting to propose this connection, not necessarily source or cause of depression, but the connection between inherited trauma and grief that could offer some hypothetical response to this therapist that appears on the first page, who takes his glasses off and rubs the bridge of his nose and says, "I'm really confused. You need to give me something here. What's making you depressed?" So this essay seems like a response, in a way, a hypothetical response. And then we get back to linguistics and etymologies in talking about the words for depression. So she gives melancholia as one, but she also points to the contrast between the words for depression in English and then the words for depression in Mohawk. And the Mohawk phrase that she points to that her sister is learning, they struggle to find the direct translation because there isn't a direct translation, and that this absence of a direct translation points to the differences culturally as well. On page 252, I've heard one person translate a Mohawk phrase for depression roughly as "his mind fell to the ground." The mind is suspended, which then she retranslates on the next page to a mind hanging by a thread, or a mind spreading out on the ground. So these ideas that can't necessarily be pinned down and directly translated, but rather loosely translated, to reflect the differences in these cultures' concepts of depression. So let's switch to the other essay here, and that's by Kim Tallbear on 154. So here we find, I wouldn't necessarily say that these are all just joyful essays, but that they are seeking joy and pleasure. And I really love this form. So this is the Critical Poly 100's essay on 154. I really love this form. I often write in this form of micro essays or mini memoirs, flash creative nonfiction, whatever you want to call it, but that she describes each of these, I'll just call them for the purposes of this video, micro memoirs. She describes this as pieces under or exactly 100 words, and the collection of these inspired by Emily Bernard, who many of you may have read the work of or heard speak or met, recent publisher, recent author of the recent book. Sorry, my mind is all over the ground right now. Black is the body. So Emily Bernard, who came up with this form of, not to say that she is the originator of writing 100-word short stories, but that she conducts writing workshops in this form. And I'm actually part of a current writing workshop with Emily Bernard that everyone in the group writes or aims to write short stories or essays 100 words or less, and we don't always succeed, but that's the structure and that's the prompt. And then trying to work within that constraint helps to motivate. That's the hope. So I just loved that she mentioned a Vermont author on the first page, but this essay is a collection of these 100-word pieces about Kim Tallbear's romantic and sexual experiences, and her, by collecting them all together, it also tells a narrative and paints a picture of her philosophy of and practice of polyamory. So I think it's interesting that not any one single 100-word essay in this piece contains the thesis. Rather, all of them collectively contain the thesis of her insisting on and explaining, not necessarily defending, but explaining her polyamorous practice. So I will just say right off the bat that I really love this essay, but I do get a little bogged down about halfway through or 2/3 of the way through the list of her relationships, partly just because it's hard for me to keep track. So I think that I really love the idea of the piece and her writing, but that maybe some of you will find this to be true as well. I lose track and I lose attention. So I want you to pay particular attention, if you haven't read it yet, to the introduction and to the form of the essay and certain details, which each of these micro memoirs are really lyrical and fascinating, but there are a lot of different places and names, and it's hard to keep track, particularly because of the form, because there are so many, and they offer a lot of detail. So I just wanted to highlight that this essay, in contrast to Eliot's, is seeking a space and carving out a space for joy, and also seeking pleasure and writing about pleasure, and defining and describing one author's philosophy of love and polyamory and relationships. So not all of the critical 100s that she includes in this collected essay are joyful. Some are painful, some are traumatic, some are hard. And yet, all together, the essay that collects all of these mini essays shows a quest for joy, and sort of like a collection of journal entries of joy. Like, these are all of the relationships, these are the encounters, this is my choir of loves. I'll stop there for now.